Okay, I'll get going, guys. So, thanks for coming along. Thanks for packing out the room for me. It's probably about the first time I've had a packed out room. This session is called There Is No Web. Specifically, not so much there is no web, but what we're going to do if there is no web. We're going to look at things like HTML5 local storage, and also we're going to look at some other things, NoSQL databases and how there's a synergy between the two and how we can make use of it to deal when there is no web. So who am I? My name's Paul Glavich. I'm an ASP.NET MVP. I've been so for about 6 years now. I'm a member of this ASP Insiders group as well, which is a bit of a smaller group that kind of talks directly with the ASP.NET team on various issues, a bit more of a closer-knit team. I'm the co-author of 3 books, the first 2 of which were ASP.NET Ajax related, so they've kind of passed their due date by about now. My latest one is one on .NET performance optimization and testing. I've got that here. I'll give that away at the end to someone who can answer some question that I'll make up on the spot. I'm also the Chief Technology Officer at Sasu.com. Sasu.com is a provider of online financial software and accounting software. They're the leading online provider in Australia. Got about 20,000 customers. So we're only a small organisation, but we do have a large customer base. There's a link to my blog and my Twitter handle. So what I'm hoping you're going to get for this at the end of all this is a couple of things. I've kind of there's nothing commercially available about this particular demo or solution I'm going to show you. It's more of just a concept and how I thought things might be able to glue together. I wanted to look at a few things. One of them being NoSQL or document databases. Kind of see a show of hands who's familiar with things like that, MongoDB, CouchDB, RavenDB, those kinds of things. So we're going to have a look at what they are and how they're going to fit into this particular solution. We're going to look at some of the HTML5 offline capabilities, local storage features, and how they work, how we might implement them, and some of the pain points around them. And finally, we're going to kind of glue it all together. We're going to use MVC in the middle. There's actually not a lot of Microsoft-specific tech in this demo. We're going to use MVC, but that's actually the smaller player in all this. I'm going to concentrate more on the HTML5 aspects as well as the NoSQL aspects and joining all those together to make one stew of awesomeness. So the agenda, we're going to look at the why. Why even bother doing all this kind of stuff? What are some of the issues or the problems that I'm trying to solve? First and foremost, it actually all started out as just I wanted to play with some new tech. You know, I wanted to learn about HTML5, the local storage. I was very interested in NoSQL technologies, and I wanted to introduce those in some way. I wasn't really sure at the start. And then as things progressed, I kind of saw some of the problems that these things began to solve. And was anybody here for Mitch Denny's session just last? Show of hands. Okay, there was talk about things like ORMs and how do you some leakage of those specific implementations into your domain model. How do you store aggregates in your database? All this kind of stuff. And it ended up being that NoSQL technologies are a good potential good solution to this because all that stuff is out of the window. Worry about repositories and how you're going to store your aggregates and all that guff. You just don't have to care. Well, to a degree. Then we'll look at a demo of what is the end product. Again, it's more of a concept thing, but we're going to have a look at how I've decided to implement and solve some of those issues, that being the issue of being offline, the issue of storing data at the browser end of the world, and also propagating that down to the database or the storage mechanism, and what has to happen in between to get all that to happen. As some of the side benefits, we're going to look at how you might be able to make changes to your domain model and just have that magically reflected on both sides without too much effort. And then I'm going to kind of take a walk through each of the components. So there's actually a lot of code to the solution that I show you. I'm not going to delve into detail in all of it. I'm just going to highlight various sections of it, the things kind of that matter. You'll be able to download the entire block of code and scrutinise it at your leisure. But for the most part, I'm just going to fly through and concentrate on the bits that are of interest. We'll have a look at the comparison between typical practices. And at the end of the demo, kind of present an ideal situation. That being where you can be online, offline, logged in, logged out. Any of those, if you're logged out or if you're offline, all those changes will be stored in the browser and be propagated down to your database, regardless of what changes you make to your domain model. If you change your domain model, for example, you don't have to change your schema. It'll just all get stored magically in a database, also propagated back up to your client side. So, a few problems. So, a typical multi-tier web application. You've got your data entities. Mitch touched on data entities in the last presentation. And you have your domain model. You have multiple entities in there. And you want to get those into your database. There's usually some mapping involved. And, you might be saying, look, I want to use plain old CLR objects. I want to keep it nice and clean. I don't want my ORM or any abstraction layer to have to get polluted by the specifics of the storage mechanism. And typically with relational databases, there's always been some sort of mapping disconnect. You've got to have something to do the mapping between an object and the database. And particularly when I'm coming up with a concept, and I'm sitting there at home and I'm playing with various concepts, I don't want to have to go through this mundane rubbish of having to go through mapping and all that kind of stuff. I mean, you can get away with things like tools like AutoMapper to make it easier for you. ORMs, they do it to a certain degree, but there's a lot of complexity involved. It's just really, really boring and not much fun. Also, web applications, obviously being web, they don't like being offline in general. They don't handle offline particularly well. In most web applications today, if it's offline, it's offline. You don't get some nice screen pop up. You don't get some alternate behavior. Now, some of the mobile browsers, on iPhones, Windows Phone 7s, etc., they're forcing the hand of that, and that you need to cater with offline more and more. So we're seeing some more support for that. But generally, offline is usually hard to cater for, or just no worky. So this obviously comes in some of the design challenges. What are you going to do about it? Particularly when the mapping comes into it. ORMs try to solve it in some capacity. Entity framework in Hibernate, Lightspeed, etc. And if you ever try to look under the covers of something like Entity Framework, it's quite capable of doing what it does, but it's extremely complex. There's multiple levels of mapping that have to go from your object to the database, backwards and forwards. EF code first, it's pretty good, but you've still got to do some glue or code between to make all that happen. What happens if their schema changes, domain model changes? How does all that propagate? Again, if you were here for Mitch's session, he did make a mention of repositories. They've seen applications where they've got an iSales repository, an iOrders repository, an iThis repository, an left leg repository. There's all this kind of stuff that it just starts to blow out. So, you've got to really be careful in managing that when trying to remain purist to the repository pattern and handle your relational database schemas and how all that's working together. Again, further design challenges on the client side. Offline's one thing. It's kind of, just a bit flip. But what happens if you're not offline but your site's down? You're not really offline, but there's some issues with your site. How do you cater for those kinds of things? How do you tell the browser what to do? How does the browser tell you what's going on? What events are being flipped there? And also, there's still an issue with data mapping. Traditionally we're using JSON to get data from the server to the client, or in the client being the browser in this case. There's still an issue of mapping there. How do you construct your entities from a JavaScript perspective and have that mapped down successfully to your server, and then finally have that mapped down to your database. So what's the ideal? Well, I alluded to this before. The ideal is you create your application, your server application, create your domain model in code, and that's it. Okay, you don't do any changes in your database, don't do any changes on your client side, and it just kind of sucks up the model. In addition, whatever changes you make in your domain model can be persisted on the client side when your application or when your web application is gone offline or your site's down. Similarly, the data storage mechanism just kind of sucks it up. You put it in an aggregate of an aggregate, collections, blah, 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 blah. It all just kind of gets stuffed in there and gets magically chewed up by your storage mechanism and given to you on request. Any changes and all that kind of thing are all handled for you. Okay, with web apps coping with offline scenario, I'm not necessarily speaking about full functionality. It depends on what kind of experience you want for your users. It might be a simple case of link redirection. So you've got your site, things have gone offline, user clicks on a link and you can say, hey, we know that things are offline. It's not going to work for you. We'll redirect once things are back online. Or you can provide some sort of partial functionality. You might be able to store some data on the client side until such time as that web app comes back online again. But generally, I think it's fair to say that coping with offline is just not displaying this message. That's about as simple as it gets. Again, just harping on the full, the link redirection that I mentioned before, coping with partial functionality when the web app goes offline. It's also the third option of going full functionality. And I will say at this point that trying to have your web application continue with full functionality when it's offline is really, really hard. And it's going to be hard for a little while yet. If you were to try and do something like that nowadays, it would be a full-fledged project on its own in addition to your standard server-based project with database, etc., etc. So it is a considerable piece of work. As we'll see in some of the demos here, some of the offline support with the browsers is somewhat inconsistent, which is not surprising, right? We've had that for some time. But it just means you've got to take in other things in your development practices on the client side to cope with all these nuances. So ideally you want to keep your offline support as simple and easy to implement as possible, and perhaps provide just some way of the user to either be notified or at least continue in some capacity to go on with operations that are important to them until such time as things go online again. So this is where I show the demo, and I'll demonstrate pretty much all of those options that I just mentioned. Okay, so what I've got here is an uber awesome application called the Journalizer. The idea is you just write a journal, you add an entry, it'll save in the database, pull it back out again. Okay, nothing too spectacular. Again, it's just a concept, nothing commercial about this. This isn't, isn't going production anywhere. So, the first use case is we're just going to sign in. Standard fare, we can add an entry. Oh, can't spell. Create that, if we go to list entries. Okay, nothing spectacular about that. So what I'm going to do now is sign out. Can I go back to add entry? And say, I'm signed out. Hit create. Okay, and you'll see that it's saying, all right, I'm not logged in, so I can't really attribute this entry to a user or anything. So I'm just going to store it locally. So what I'm then going to do is sign back in. You can see now we've got the synchronize option there. If I just go to list entries quickly and just ignore this bar at the top here for now, I'll explain that in a second. So back at home, if I go to synchronize now, click on list entries and you can see that's been synchronized there. Okay, next one. So we're logged in, we're adding entries. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hit allow. So obviously this bar up the top here, and I should explain a bit further. I'm using Firefox here at the moment simply because its support of offline mechanisms is a bit more explicit. In things like Chrome and Safari, I don't get that little bar at the top. It's just much more explicit, nicer for demos. There are still nuances, which I'll show you a bit later on, between things like Chrome and Safari and well, I was going to say IE, but I'm not going to show you much of IE in terms of offline support. Okay, so I'm going to hit allow. Everything's good. You'll see this message come up. That's actually my code showing that. I'm going to explain that client script to you a bit later on. So now I'm going to say, all right, let's go offline. You see a little offline flicker on over there, title, I'm offline, blah, blah, hit create, and of course, same thing happens as we did before. We go online, we can synchronize, that'll synchronize. If I go offline again, now you saw I went to the list entries screen before. If I go to list entries now that we're offline, you can see I've actually redirected to a different page. And I'm also getting redirected to a completely different page there of awesome style prowess. So what I'm doing there is I mentioned that before, this concept of link redirection. So the user still wants to bounce around your site, but you're providing probably one of the most simplistic ways of dealing with offline operations, just to say, well, look, we know it's offline. So we'll sort of let you know of a message, and we might sort of notify you when it comes back online. So I'll go the offline. If I go switch it online again, with any luck, and we're back again. Okay. All right, so moving right along. So that's kind of the concepts behind it. Oh, one of the things I will mention, as I mentioned, there's all these nuances with browsers. Once you go online, once you go offline and the browser wants to cache all its data, I found that a lot of the browsers do different things when they cache the data. They don't like to let it go once it's cached. Now, in all the theory for all offline storage and caching mechanisms, once you change certain aspects or certain resources, the browser is supposed to reload it. Doesn't always happen that way. In fact, I haven't been able to reliably reproduce every scenario, but there's things where you'll just get links that kind of don't work sometimes, and online links, when it goes back online after a full cache refresh, it doesn't sort of link back all the time. It's really bizarre behavior, and some of these things are hard to get around with in code. They're certainly possible to circumvent, but it goes back to what I was saying before, that if you want to come up with an offline application for the web using these features, be prepared to spend some dev time. The majority of the mechanics will work fine, but dealing with the different nuances of different browsers is actually really, really hard. And just by way of comparison, I mean, I'm not on the internet at the moment. You can see it saying online there. Chrome will say the same thing if I do that. If I load that one up, I'll load up Safari. Oh, I'll copy that URL. And you can see Safari comes straight up with offline. So already, you know, and this is just using these HTML5 support to determine what's online and offline. Already there's differences in the browsers. Okay, so we'll get to a bit later on about how we can sort of get around those things. But I just think it's one of the important points to beware of, because if, again, it's, you know, you read blogs and say, well, this online and offline feature, these are awesome, you can do this and everything's hunky-dory, and, you know, 10 minutes and you're done. It's not going to happen that way. Okay. So we're going to kind of move up the stack. I'm going to start down at the database layer and just mention that. I'm going to go up to the server, and then I'll go up to the client, describing the components there and how they all join together. And then at the very end, I'm kind of going to show you how they all just magically work together and how you can fit in your domain model for that. So at the bottom level is something called RavenDB. It's our NoSQL document-based storage mechanism. By document-based, any blob or any object you send into that database, it just gets serialized as a blob. In RavenDB's case, as a JSON object. It doesn't matter how deep that nesting goes, it kind of just shuffles it all in there, aggregates everything. There's no relational integrity with this particular document database, but it's fast, and you don't have to worry about schema. You don't define any schema, ever. You just stuff some stuff in there. Stuff an object, grab the object back out. End of story. RavenDB was written by a guy called Allende. He's, I don't know if you guys are familiar, has a blog. Very, very smart guy, very much in the .NET space. And this RavenDB is written in .NET. You can get the source code, I can't remember the address, so it's on their website there, which I've got links at the end of this deck. Yeah, it's all very, very .NET friendly. Okay, so there's a nice clean API to use. I'll show you a bit of that later on. I did look at using things like MongoDB at the start, and that's a really nice database to use as well. But RavenDB was, I guess, much nicer from a .NET perspective. It supports full support for transactions. It supports dynamic indexes. So what I mean by that is if in code you execute a link query against RavenDB, what it does, it says, oh, okay, you've executed a link query. I'm going to create that as a temporary index, and then I'm going to start indexing. So if you ever execute that query again, it executes against that index that's being built up in the background for you. So you don't need to explicitly define any indexes. You just execute link queries, and stuff happens. It supports geospatial queries, full support for replication as well. Again, this is a free download. It's really easy to set a lot of this stuff up. The hardest thing is getting around the concepts, but to get it going, it's really, really easy and extremely powerful. Its search mechanism is Lucene-based, if you're familiar with the Lucene search engine. You don't have to use that, but you can use advanced search queries based on the Lucene syntax. Okay, a bit of a demo on RavenDB. So remember, this is just the database portion of it. And you're thinking, well, this doesn't have that much to do with, with HTML offline, and there is no web and all that rubbish. It does and it doesn't. It's a handy storage mechanism. And again, I'm going to show you the synergy between that and the client storage, the local storage in the browser. So this is where IE gets a play into my particular demo. It's probably the only time you're going to see it as well. So I kind of have to include it, otherwise it tends to cry and go to a corner. Okay, so first up, in the background here I've got RavenDB running. And all it is, if I list it out, you can see a bunch of assemblies there. In order to get this started, I'm just going to run the Raven server exe. It stores its data in a data directory. Now I'm running it as in a console app here, but it's easy enough to install as a service. Just use a -install on that exe and it'll install itself as a service. So running that up. Here at localhost 8080, which is a default admin interface, you get this web page come up. Got some global statistics to look at, that's not very exciting. If I look at the documents that are in there, you can see some of the things that I've stored in that last quick demo. If I click on one of these guys, excuse me, you can see this is its default view. I look at the raw JSON, and that's how it's been stored in RavenDB. Nothing spectacular about it. And again, this stores aggregated entities quite easily. It'll store, object with an object with an object with an object. It's just standard JSON stuff to it. It doesn't really care. It's very, very tolerant for entity changes. You remove a field, you add a field. It's not going to throw up errors when you try and retrieve it and save it. It doesn't care. It'll just, if there's, for example, if there's a field that's present in the entity that you're trying to retrieve into, but it's not present in the object in RavenDB, it just doesn't populate. Easy. No errors, no anything. Which of course means that you've got to take some corrective measures if you want to cater for those kinds of scenario, particularly in versioning and things like that. But it doesn't throw up an error. It makes it just kind of, as I said before, it just kind of sucks it up. If we have a look at some of the indexes, okay, you can see these temp ones here. They're just based on the usage that I've got in in my server code. This has been created for me. I haven't created any of these guys. If we have a look at that, this is what it's done for me. It's based on the journal entries. I'm having a look at the created date or doing a search by created date. It does utilise this MapReduce concept, which I won't go into a lot here, but you can get very specific and very efficient about how this works. And this plays well into replication as well. It makes replication for it a lot easier. Okay, so that's just the admin part of it. If I look at the code, if I go to my data layer, now I've got a journal repository here. Actually, I'll go a step back one. I've got a repository factory, so I've got a class that's going to create me a repository. It's going to create something that's based on iDocument Store, which is a Raven-specific interface. And that's simply a matter of executing create document store. I'm creating a new document store, giving it a connection string name, which is journalizer. In my web config, the journalizer connection string is that. Okay, it's pretty basic, nothing spectacular about it. You can specify extra security or authentication requirements in that connection string, but for the most part, you can leave it like that if you like. So the repository factory is just giving me an iDocument store based on some connection string. In the actual repository itself, when I'm using that, let me go full screen. So I've got an add document here, further down here, delete document. But what I'm doing is creating a new context based on that document store open session, putting that in a using statement, and then I'm asking, in this particular case, the context to store an entry and save the changes. You notice I've got some, I'm using generics up here, so I'll take in any entity. In this case, I'm using an I-based document, which is something I've created, just so I've got a common set of properties to use. But as long as any object that I pass in or ask to get out implements that interface, it'll happily go and store it away for me. And again, I'm placing the constraint, not Raven placing the constraint on what to add and what to retrieve. So using it is quite easy. Again, you're just doing a using statement, creating a context, much like you would with something like Entity Framework. Just ignore this for a second here. Delete document, creating a new session, deleting the entry, saving changes. Further down, updating a document, again just asking it to store and saving changes. Pretty easy to use. One of the things to be aware of is, again, I mentioned RavenDB is quite developer friendly. So if you've got a field named ID in your entities, if you don't fill it up and you store it into RavenDB, it'll provide a key for you. If you have an ID field with something already in there, RavenDB won't worry about it and store it with that key. And if we have a look, if I go back to IE, let's have a look at this guy here. There's the key that RavenDB has assigned for me. I haven't had to explicitly do that at all. So it's trying to provide the path of least resistance for you. So if you were here at Mitch's session before, he was talking about repositories. With this particular approach, you can have one repository for every single CRUD operation that you ever hope to do on any entities, which kind of cuts out a lot of work for you. It'll just, again, push any entity down into the database, suck it back up again. What you might want to split things out into is specific queries, for example, but that then makes it, it's kind of up to you how you split that out. You've got much more flexibility. It's not based on what type of entity and all that kind of stuff where you might start to split out repositories. All your CRUD operations is just one. A couple of things to be aware of with RavenDB though. If we go back up here. When it creates an index, it's based off this concept of eventual consistency. So when you store something in RavenDB and you try and query by it for using an index straight away, you may not get that back straight away. That index may not have been updated in time. It updates indexes in the background. Okay, so you have to be aware of that. It's good for performance, but of course, if you want to store and retrieve straight away, may not be what you're after. It does provide support where you want to circumvent that particular performance gain. And you can see here, I'm saying, right, with the context, I want to create a query based on that entity. And just ignoring that for a sec, just doing a standard where clauses on created date and take maximum number of records. That'll go and query that index for me. But what I'm saying here is I want to customize that query specifically, and I want to wait for non-stale results as of now. So that's saying, all right, I know you're querying stuff in the background, but I really want you to be up to date as of right now before you return your results. So in this case, I'd be sacrificing performance for up-to-date data. Up to you how you want to make that call, but it does provide support for it. By default, it'll just index it in the background, and you'll just get where it's up to at a particular stage of time. Okay. So that's a quick overview of Raven. There are some sites out there that are using that in production at the moment. I think Pluralsight use it. Pluralsight got a stand down in TechEd. I'm pretty sure they use it in the back end. It has been used in Azure to store millions and millions and millions of records. It's a pretty specific implementation for Azure because it does use a local storage, but it has been used in Azure. It's used by a couple other companies as well. There's a link at the end where you can go to RavenDB website and it'll show you everybody who's using it currently. Okay, onto the server component. So we're moving up the stack. And this is probably the easiest part of it. I mean, there's not much to it. This is really just the glue in between. So I've created on the server just a simple plain old CLR domain model or object. And it's fairly simple for the purposes of this Dinky Die demo. You saw the generic T repository already. And we're utilising dependency injection to inject our repositories where we need them. There are a few specifics which I've whacked in there, which I'll take you through now. Oh, you know what, that one? Is everybody here familiar with the dependency injection support in MVC3? Just a show of hands. I'll just dive into it very quickly. Okay, in the global ASAX, if I go down here, I'm using Ninject to do some dependency resolution for me. This is where I specify the journal repository, the document store, and I've chosen Ninject for no particular reason other than I think it's probably one of the easiest to read and therefore good to demo. I use AutoFac within Sasu, but again for demos I use Ninject. Nothing special here, I'm just injecting the repositories. As far as the object that I'm using, my domain model, my massive domain model, I've got a journal entry. Okay, it's not particularly complex, but it does the job. Finally, the only other thing of note within the MVC part of this is this JSON model serializer. So I mentioned that we want our domain model on the server. We want that to be shuffled into RavenDB, into the storage mechanism, regardless of what we change. We also want that to be reflected on the client side in JavaScript so that we can make use of it. So what this guy does here, this create JSON model definition, it serializes our entity into JSON for us. I'm using the data contract JSON serializer. And then this method is eventually called, I'll show you where that is in a second, to create a script tag that'll do something like that. It'll have a function that'll say journal entry model creator. And on JavaScript then I can just call that to get me whatever is the representation of my domain entity, in this case a journal entry. In this particular instance I'm using a convention, so whatever the model name is will go there and it'll be suffixed by model creator, and in the JavaScript I can just call that function, it'll give me an accurate representation of the domain model. Where that's done, if I go to the view and I go to shared, I've just got a helper here that says write journal entry JSON definition, and because all the pages share that, it just spits out that function for me. Okay, so that's kind of the glue part that I'm talking about. Again, all that means is that RavenDB already takes care of any domain model changes. You know, JavaScript, the client side, that's not going to just automatically do that, and that's what this is doing for me. There's probably a bunch of different ways you can do that, and this is just one of the simplest. Is everybody with me so far? Woo, okay. All right, next. Finally onto the client. So, as I mentioned before, we're utilising HTML5, a specific set of features, the local storage to store the entities, which you saw at the start when I was things like I wasn't logged in or I was offline. We're also using the detection of that offline capability within browsers. So within browsers now you'll get an online and offline event when the browser detects either or, and that'll be fired for you that you can listen to. As well as using something called an offline application manifest. I believe it's called the app cache now. And what this concept is a file that's stored on your web page that says, hey, all right, I'm going to support offline capabilities or offline storage or caching of any resources. And here's a file defining what resources I want you as a browser to go and grab for me that I'm going to store offline so you can use if I do go offline. So starting off with the application manifest. At the start of your page, you'll need something like this. A manifest equals whatever the file name is. And again, that bit there is for no particular, I'm not sure why, they just want it called app cache now. It used to be called manifest. You can still use manifest, there's nothing preventing you. But it's just the standard that they want to use. It must be served with the correct MIME type, which is not by default in most web servers. That's the text cache manifest that you see up there. So you need to add that into things like IIS for those kinds of file types to be served correctly. And it's a simple text file that just describes all the resources that you need to load in for offline support. So you can see a lot of the browsers support it there, apart from one notable. So that's why I'm not using it, because it would be pointless. So just to have a quick look at that file. Back up, good. So if I look at this cache manifest file here, you can see pretty much a simple text file. What we must have at the start is cache manifest. These hashes represent comments. And I've got a cache directive there that says, all right, anything after here is what I want you to specifically load into your offline cache. And this can be relative references, like you see I've got there. It can be explicit references, so HTTP, blah, 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 blah. It'll go off and grab that for you. Excuse me. And I've got CSS, HTML files, JS files, whatever resources you need to have your application working in an offline manner. Okay, pretty easy stuff. This network here is the resources that I explicitly don't want cached. Okay, so by default, when you've got a manifest tag on your page, the web browser will want to cache that page. Okay, but through using this mechanism, you can say, all right, for these resources, I don't want you to cache it at all. I always want you to try and go to the server to get that. And what we've got here is also a fallback scenario. So that, and this little trick here is saying, all right, for anything that you can't find from that route on, I want you to go and use that fallback page. Okay, and what I didn't show you before is if I go back here, let's go offline. Now hopefully this will work. If I just type in some non-existent page, okay, I actually go to a fallback page. That fallback page you saw specified in the cache manifest, and is just that simple page there. Okay, so even though that page was non-existent, it went and jumped off. Is there a question at the back there? Sorry, I couldn't figure spear. Okay, so the question was, does that fallback page need to be explicitly cached? The answer is no, that fallback directive will take care of it for you. Okay, so that's kind of the cache manifest in a nutshell. One of the other things I also didn't mention, see that I've got in the network here, I've got this ping.js that I'm saying, oh, I always want you to go back and get that file for me. And what this is doing, I mentioned that the online-offline support It's not too solid always among the different browsers. It can lie sometimes. One of the things I didn't also show before was, let's say we're online. Let me just clear the cache out actually, make sure we're all good to go. And one of the other things I should also mention is that different browsers have different ways of clearing their cache. Once stuff's in the cache, I mentioned I think once before, it's really hard to get it out sometimes. You know, you'll think that you've made an update to your page and the browser's saying, well, no, I've got it in the cache. You know, I'm going to use the cache versions. With Firefox, in order to get around some of the issues I have to go down into this deep, deep pit of directories and delete those files to absolutely ensure, or I found in my experience, to absolutely ensure that you get an updated cache. Now what the rules of the game state is that when there's a change to your cache manifest, and it's supposed to be any byte level change, the browser will reload all the cached resources. And in theory that would be awesome if it always worked, but again in my experience there's been instances where Firefox just didn't do that. There's been instances in Chrome where it just didn't do that, not always. And so it was really hard to figure out what problem was going on when in fact you weren't working with a version of the script that you thought you were working with. So those kinds of dev tricks you really have to be aware of, and that's where there's a big time suck involved in this kind of stuff. So if you were to approach this, again that's why I'm saying simple is best if you can get away with it, because it will sort of, well, tear your hair out. Just for your information, Chrome, you can see, hasn't given us a little prompt at the top there, but it has in fact cached everything. You can see that there's a whole list of items that it's gone and cached for us. Now those messages that you see are something that I've provided, and I'll show you the class that does that a bit later on. But if you wanted to clear Chrome's cache, you go to that address, and you can see that it's got my cache manifest there, and I'll say remove it from the cache, and we're good to go. So that's one way of removing it. Each browser has a little bit different methods, so it's important to find out what that method is, otherwise again you'll be causing yourself some dev pain. Now I've kind of gone off the track a little bit. If I load up IS Manager, one of the things I didn't show you before, and I stop that, you should see this little guy eventually. Anytime. Come on, you can do it. Oh. Ah, man. Sorry, bear with me a sec. Okay. I'm going to stop that. Oh, probably did that too soon. And you can see it go offline there. So what I'm doing in order to get around some of the inconsistencies between online and offline detection is just doing a simple polling of this ping.js that I showed you in the cache manifest before. It's obviously not the best way to do things, but it is a way of saying, all right, well, if the browser's telling me I'm online, and we already saw that Firefox told us we were online and Chrome told us we were online, but I'm not really online, I'm actually offline. Only Safari accurately reported that. I've got this little ping mechanism going on that's kind of a double check. So in the code that I'll show you a bit later on, it says if the browser telling me I'm online, well, I don't entirely believe you. Let's go do a poll and see what's happening on the server. But using that mechanism, I can also tell whether the site's down or not. So it's kind of an extra benefit that goes along with that. And because it's just JavaScript, once this thing goes offline, it's just JavaScript that takes over from that point on, I can still take the same countermeasures. Okay, coming back here. Okay, moving along from the cache manifest. So offline, how do you tell? Very simply, online and offline events within the browser. You can see I'm using jQuery here to bind those particular events. And as I mentioned before, they can lie. And you've seen that they can lie. Firefox lies, Chrome lies, Safari's pretty good. And I think the reason Safari is good is it's probably borrowing some of that mobile heritage or mobile functionality. It's had to deal with it probably for a lot longer, and so they're probably sharing some code base there. And you've seen that I've already mentioned that while all the latest browsers support this, you may need to augment this via good old-fashioned polling, which is exactly what I've done. Okay, so where we do that, yep, good. So if I go into my scripts, and I've got a whole bunch of HTML5 scripts here. If I go into this network status class, and again, I'm not going to go through everything in detail, but going down here, this is where I bind the online and offline events of the browser. Okay, so that's pretty easy code. You know, you can just do an add event listener or use jQuery to do it. But beyond that, once I've detected this particular online, I'm still going to go and double check the network status. And what I'm doing here is saying, all right, if navigator online is either undefined or it's equal to true, if I'm saying, if the browser's telling me I'm online, I'm saying, well, potentially I think you're rubbish. I'm going to go execute this async call, go looking for ping.js just to be sure. Okay, so while the offline event is handy, it's not entirely accurate, still having to resort to this kind of method. Which isn't entirely a bad thing. Again, you can detect whether your site's down, so you can be a little bit more specific about that. You know, that may come in handy for deployments, those kinds of things. And there's multiple ways to do that as well, but polling's pretty easy. Looking at the cache, the next sort of phase of things. We'll do it for time, 4:13. How much time have I got left? Okay, all right. So looking at the cache, window.application cache is the object we'll be looking at. It's a new part of the HTML5 DOM API. I showed you in Chrome those events that were listed out at the bottom when it was loading resources. That's what I'm hooking into to display those things. There's a whole bunch of events that you can hook into. It's pretty easy to do. And for most of the things that I've created around here, I've put a helper class around that. So I'll just show you that quickly as well. So you're probably getting the feel at the moment that you know, there's a little bit of plumbing that I've kind of had to add to everything. And that's the point that I was trying to make at the start. All this HTML5 is good. You just please, you know, don't think it's just going to be too easy. So I've got this cache manager in JavaScript, and here in the setup handlers, let's go full screen for you. I'm just hooking into all these different events and spitting out a message. Okay, that's more for debugging purposes. I find it handy to know what's happening when. It'll tell you when it doesn't have to load it because the cache is already up to date, when it is loading it, those kinds of things. One of the oddities of it is that in certain browsers, and I think there were some older versions of Safari and Firefox that needed this, is that when you receive an update ready event, you need to swap out the cache and do a page reload. But that's not true of all browsers, so I'm doing it anyway. So what I'm doing is say, when there's an update ready in terms of the offline cache, I'm going to say to the application cache, all right, do an update, so the cache gets updated. Then I'm going to ask you to swap the cache out to your new cache. And finally, do a window location reload. All right. While that's not immediately apparent that you should do it, as I mentioned, after a bit of scouring through their wonderful interwebs, some browsers need this, some browsers don't. Chrome doesn't really honour this. In fact, it doesn't need it. It seems to cater with all the offline cache events quite well. Firefox tends to need it, and again, I think some of the older versions of, not too older, but prior versions of Safari do need that as well. In particular, some of the mobile versions, I believe. And again, if you're not, you don't have to necessarily write all this down. All this code's available in entirety to download afterwards if you like. It's available now. Okay, finally, browser local storage. This is similar to the blob concept of RavenDB and NoSQL. This is kind of the synergy that I was talking about before. It just will serialize to JSON, whack it down on the local storage of the browser, and the amount of storage you can store depends on each particular browser. From memory, I think Firefox has 5 meg and Chrome has 10 meg. Safari, I think, is 5 meg. I'm not 100% sure on the exact specifics of that. A user can change how much they can store based on settings, but 5 meg's a reasonable amount. It's just a simple API: set item, remove item, get item. I think there's clear. And there's another method called key, which is not so useful. But obviously, the get item, set item, remove item, pretty simple stuff. Exactly the same way that we saw for RavenDB, I should say. So again, that's where there's a little bit of synergy going on. So because we can serialize up on the client side, RavenDB is going to serialize down on the database side, and everything's just going to flow nicely. There are some third-party tools which you can wrap around it. One of them being Amplify.js, which is a good tool. Amongst other things, it will place a wrap around the local storage. It does a whole bunch of other stuff as well, but I encourage you to check that out. And again, as is my want, I've created somewhat of an abstract layer around the usage of that local storage, a thin data access layer, which I'll take you through now. Okay. Oop. Okay, so you can see here, I've got this data layer, and the only thing, there's nothing really special about this. I'm detecting whether it's available. So I'm checking for this local storage property in window and whether it's undefined. So I can make that check later on. But generally, what I'm doing is I've assigned window local storage to this storage object here. And all I'm doing when I need to get something is using get item, using a key, and also using a set item to store stuff in. Specifying the key, but what's particular at the moment is I'm doing JSON stringify, to get that object into the local storage. I believe future versions of this API won't require you to do JSON stringify, they'll do it for you. But I think as of now, you just still need to do this JSON stringify to stringify it for you. And all the rest of this data access layer is just about making it easier for me to store stuff in. All I'm doing is anytime there's something stored into the local storage, is I'll say, all right, update a counter, which is my little document index about how many items are stored in there. If there's 3 items, each item's going to have a key of 1, 2, and 3. It's just as simple as that. So it's just a sequential store. And so I'm just provide some methods that wrap all that around. And some events that say, all right, provide a callback when it's successfully stored. That's all this data access layer is doing. The main portion of this is, again, set item, get item, and there's a remove item here. Right there, you can see I'm just using a remove item of an ID, and it'll just take that out of local storage. Okay, that's actually pretty easy, and the data access layer is one of the more better APIs to use across all browsers, and IE actually supports this. So, that's always a good thing. Okay, moving on from local storage. I know I'm going through a lot of these aspects quite quickly, but I'm just kind of trying to give you an overview of all this because there is a lot of code in the whole solution. And again, I don't want to sort of bore you with too many details. If you're interested in looking into it further, again, you can grab the source code a bit later on. It did take me a while to come up with all the wrappers and support for all this. So again, harping back onto there, it takes a lot of development time to get this done. Okay. So, the end game. Wow, we're here already. Okay, so what I mentioned before was getting to this end game where I can just add something to the domain model and it'll be stored in the database. It'll propagate to all tiers, including the client tier for JavaScript. Yes, no need to add water. So that's what I'm going to do now. Okay. So, come back up here. Thank you. So what I'm going to do is in my model, my journal entry model, I'm going to make sure there's some fields available, and someone's been here before me and they've commented out for me. That's awfully nice of them. Okay, so I'll compile that. That's good to go. What I'm going to do now, just make sure my cache is cleared there. Okay, good. So I'm going to just do a list entries for now. And there's nothing spectacular about that, but it's managed to go and get those entities without too much of an issue. The domain model's changed, but it's still retrieving those, even though there's no values for that particular domain entity. So I'm just looking at the database side at the moment. If I sign in, just one. I don't want to do that. And I do, blah, create that. So blah's there and it's been created. So even though I made some changes to that journal entry, it's gone and saved that into RavenDB for me. No complaints whatsoever. If I go, let's just refresh this to see if we can find it. There's blah there. Okay, and you'll see that the fields are actually in there. So there's some stuff. New field is there, but it's blank. If I go to one of the other items, that doesn't have that in there. So you can see some disparity starting to occur. But RavenDB is happy with that, and similarly, when it populates its domain model, it's also happy with that. What's been done as a result of that as well, I showed you that JSON model serializer. So that's taking our domain model and spitting it up into the page. So at the moment, our page has this journal entry model creator, which will create a JavaScript object for us, which matches our domain model. But in order to utilize that on the client, we do have to make some changes to make it visible and pick up the correct data. So if I go into my views, and where should we go? Into list journals. Oh, look at that, someone's already commented out for me again. Excellent. So all I'm doing there is making sure that I can display new field. And in the add to journal view, where are you? Obviously I want to try and capture that. Oh. Okay, so I'm allowing that field to be captured from the viewer, the add to journal view, and also displaying it on the list journals. Finally, in order to support that being stored in local or offline storage, I obviously have to pick out that value from somewhere. JavaScript's going to have to pick it up so that it can stuff it into the object. So if I go into scripts and go to my add to journal, and I just uncomment that and say, all right, you can see here, this is where I'm calling a function to create the model, and I'm just saying, all right, utilize that new field. I haven't really done anything else apart from change it on the server side. And I know that the ID is that, and go populate it with its value, and then store it, use the data access layer to store that. Okay, so let's just compile that, make sure I'm up to date. Go in here and see what we can do. Let's sign out, add an entry, sorry. I'll go new field, woot. Okay, let's sign back in. Oh, so I should be able to synchronize that now. And any luck? Oh. Now let me try that again. All right, So I think it's because I didn't properly refresh the JavaScript to take into account that I was picking up the new field. So, before I actually go into that, yep. So what we did just then, obviously I made some changes to the domain model. RavenDB was okay with it, stored all that into the database, and it retrieved it from the database, as you saw in that last part where we saw the field displayed up there. I just had to make some changes to the views so they could be displayed and captured, as well as the JavaScript, so it picks up that new field. But other than that, that domain model is my source of truth. Didn't have to worry about any schema on RavenDB. I didn't have to worry about doing any mapping on the JavaScript side. I just had to make sure those fields were picked up. And it would store it in local storage. It would send it down to the server. Server would send it on a database, retrieve it back up again, and it was all good. Again, making that domain model the source of truth and making that work in an online and offline manner. So, exactly what I just said. One of the things that I didn't highlight too much was this link redirection. And I'll just show you briefly. I won't, again, go into too much detail with the code. And again, the link redirection is probably the easiest mechanism to do. So if you can get away with something like that and just notifying users that it's offline and you'll sort of refresh the page once it comes back, that's probably a good option. But in my main, what I'm doing here is I've got a series of offline and online links. So when it's online, this is the normal URL that it goes to. When it goes offline, my network status class captures that and it fires an event and says, all right, I want you to map any links for me. So it goes through whatever page it's on, finds any links with that, and maps it to the offline portions of it. Okay, so the JavaScript goes and changes the URL. And because they're stored in the offline cache, when the user clicks on that, it goes over to that page, displays that page, and everything's good. When it goes back online, again, my class will capture that. It'll do a redirection for us, as well as remapping those links back to their proper online components. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, so that's about all I had to show you. Again, just one of the key points, and I kept harping on this, is that as I've gone through developing this concept, I wanted to learn about Raven and HTML5 local storage. It was really painful having to work with offline caching and the nuances and semantics with offline caching. Sometimes you had the cache data, sometimes you had the live data, sometimes in Chrome you had the live data, but in Firefox you didn't have the live data, but sometimes in Safari you did, and sometimes in the other ones you didn't, and you're thinking, my God, what's going on here? It can become quite confusing, and it was very hard. Again, if you're attempting to get a lot of functionality out of using this kind of offline technology, get prepared to spend a lot of time getting that right. You'll get to a 70% sort of stage, but then after that, you're going to find some real weirdness that goes along. So if you can get away with simple functionality first and then add in some complexity where required, that's probably a good approach. It's not to say don't use it, because I think it's got a lot of potential, and things will get much, much better. But just be aware of some of these caveats. Has anybody got any questions? Yes, up the back. Yep, so the question was almost, if I could paraphrase, why bother with that, just program from the offline mode? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a great approach. You could do that too. In fact, that's probably a really good approach to take, because you're working with the highest risk elements first up, and you're dealing with those up front, which is a good project approach. Attack the highest risk elements first, get those out of the way. The rest should be a piece of cake. Any other questions? Yes.
Just curious, with the fallback page that you can declare as a manifest,
yep.
Is there any way, once they hit that page, like through the JavaScript or something, to tell where they were actually trying to go?
So the question was, in that fallback page, is there any way to tell where they were actually trying to go? Not sure. Not that I'm aware of. I'd have to play with that one. Not sure. Yeah, one more question before I give away the book. So you guys miss out. Yes. So the question has, have I used this in a live scenario? And the answer is no. No, I haven't. Before I'd use such a thing in a live scenario, what I haven't shown is there's some issues where you'll go offline, then go online, then go offline and click on a live link and it kind of just spins forever until you do a page reload. And there's things like that that I haven't overcome yet. And I'd need to spend a lot more time doing it. For the purposes of demo, I didn't think it was worth it, and B, I think it's more important to learn about the deficiencies rather than trying to mask those kinds of things. But you'll encounter those things, and I haven't done it live yet. Primarily because also, you know, IE doesn't provide a lot of support for you. You're going to have to get around a lot of that. And is it worth the effort at the moment? You know, it depends. It depends. So before I answer another question, in order to win the book, what do I really hate? Yeah, all right. All right, I'll leave it up here for you. Is there any more questions? Okay, thank you very much, everybody. I hope you enjoyed it.